You've termed anxiety as like a rocking chair. Now, I thought this was a really interesting analogy. Can you explain what you mean by this?
What I mean by that is it moves us emotionally. We spend a lot of time invested in it. We're really activated or paralyzed, but emotionally, we're really moved by it.
Clinical psychologist
Anna Colton.
Dr. Anna.
Dr Anna Colton, clinical psychologist.
So when I think of it as a bully, it's in contexts where it's not saving our lives, but it's inhibiting us because it sits in our head all the time, chucking out negative chat. Yes, we can say it's alerting us to danger, but on the other hand, it's undermining and it's denigrating and it's preventing us from living a full life. And the problem is, the easiest way to think about them is anxiety is future focused, depression is more past focused. Being in the present is wherever possible the best place to be. If you curate your accounts and you are careful with who you follow, you can get some really, really great stuff. For example, when you said that, you said something so important, which is that it's a familiar state. And if you think about, again, if we go back to evolutionary times, self-sabotage can come from a whole range of different places, but usually we self-sabotage because
You've termed anxiety as like a rocking chair. Now, I thought this was a really interesting analogy. Can you explain what you mean by this?
yeah. So what I mean by that is it moves us emotionally. We spend a lot of time invested in it. We're really activated or paralyzed, but emotionally we're really moved by it. But just like a rocking chair, we spend all our time moving with it, but we don't travel. So
So
it
we
doesn't
don't
get us anywhere.
we don't go anywhere. It just sits
Don't
with
go
us,
anywhere.
and
It sits with us and it moves us and it stimulates us and it gives us the jitters and we become totally engaged with it and activated or deactivated by it, but we don't travel. We don't go anywhere. It's quite a static state. Now, that is only when you get kind of caught by it and you don't use it, because you can use it. You can use it to say, okay, I feel quite anxious about this. Have I done everything that I can do to keep myself, my family safe? Have I done everything that I can do to mitigate whatever I see that threat as being? And once you have done that, you say, is there anything else I can do? Or is this just a kind of my brain chucking out warnings that actually are not going to be helpful? And in that case, you can then do the things you need to do and it can activate you and it can motivate you. But when people really struggle with anxiety, they tend not to be motivated or activated by it. They tend to get stuck in it or with it.
you have also termed anxiety a bully. But at the same time, we absolutely need some degree of anxiety, as you've alluded to there. Can you square these two? I haven't heard somebody call anxiety a bully before, so could you explain that?
So yeah, for sure. Before I go down that path, you're absolutely right. It is a primal survival mechanism, right? But luckily, certainly, in the UK or in much of the world today, we are lucky enough not to really need it as we did when we were hunter-gatherers and hunting for our food. We don't need it in the same way. We still need it in times of proper threat. If we are in a life-threatening, dangerous situation, my goodness, do we need it? It's the thing that makes us jump off the road if we've drifted into the road and there's a car coming at speed and we don't have time to rationally process what's happening. We suddenly find ourselves on the pavement with our heart pounding. That is all the kind of the anxiety system. It keeps us alive and it keeps us safe, and we 100% need it. However, most of us don't need that level of anxiety most of the time. We are really lucky. So when I think of it as a bully, it's in contexts where it's not saving our lives, but it's inhibiting us. And it's actually detracting from our lives and stopping us stopping us from doing the things we want to do. And in those senses, it is like a bully because it sits in our head all the time, chucking out negative chat. Mustn't do that. This disaster is going to happen. Oh, no, 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 no. If you do that, then, so and so won't like you, or so and so will judge you, or you're going to lose your job, or you're not going to pass your exams, or this disaster is going to happen, or that catastrophe is coming. What if this? What if that? And so you have this constant, exhausting kind of denigrator. I don't think you're good enough, or that's going to be bad, or you've misjudged, or you're going to misjudge, whatever form one's anxiety takes. In a social situation, for example, no, that person's not going to like you and that one's going to judge you and you mustn't go to that party and you mustn't go and talk to that person because what if? And in those situations, it's like it works quite like a bully. Yes, we can say it's alerting us to danger, but on the other hand, it's undermining and it's denigrating and it's preventing us from living a full life. And the problem is, because it lives in our heads, we can't, walk away and change our company. We can't shut down the computer and stop the cyberspace. It is there 24 hours a day, chatting away. And that's why I think sometimes people really find it a kind of a way of seeing it that really resonates for them. They find it a really useful metaphor, and it also then enables them to think, well, if it's a bully, what would I do with a bully? What strategies would that enable me to use that I might use in a different context? And that opens up a different way of dealing with it.
You've touched upon a few different things which I want to come back to at some point in the conversation, but I suppose my question then is, why is it so difficult for so many people to deal with their anxiety? Do you think people who suffer from anxiety, some people who suffer from anxiety do so almost voluntarily, in that it is the devil they know, it is a familiarity, it is a familiar state, and they would rather experience a suffering and a pain that's familiar to them instead of something that is unfamiliar to them, which is a state of a lack of anxiety, for want of a better term.
Or even just less. I think you when you said that, you said something so important, which is that it's a familiar state. And if you think about, again, if we go back to evolutionary times, familiarity equates in the mind with safety. The cave was safe. It was familiar. It was where the tribe was. It's where protection, warmth, safety was. That was familiar. You went out onto the plain to hunt. It was unfamiliar territory. It was unsafe. You had to be vigilant for predators. You were hunting and you were being hunted. So I think when you look at it like that, if we think that actually something that feels familiar feels safe, whether or not we like it, we can see why people gravitate towards something that feels familiar, because we know it. It's known to us. And often most of us fear the unknown because the what ifs come crashing in. But what if I am less anxious, and therefore I'm not paying enough attention to the danger around me, and therefore something terrible happens and it's all my fault because I stopped being so anxious? What if? So those what ifs are really pernicious and they're pervasive. And when they come crashing in, there's always a reason not to confront or not to challenge. It has to be so, because it's a really difficult thing to do. And what you need to do then, going back to the familiarity point, is if the anxiety is so familiar, bit by bit, when you're working with the anxiety, you need to make a state of lesser anxiety familiar so that it feels safe, whilst making the anxious state slightly less familiar so it feels slightly less safe. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. So then, extending on from that point, does self-sabotage come from the same desire to sit in a place that's familiar?
God, you're asking all sorts of interesting questions for so early in the morning. Self-sabotage can come from a whole range of different places, but usually we self-sabotage because somewhere deep down we're really worried about, if we do this and we don't succeed, what does it say about us? Or if we do this and we fail, what does that mean about us? Or what will happen to our relationships? Or what will happen to our work? So there's a kind of possibility that taking the risk is more threatening than not taking the risk. That makes sense, whatever it is we want to do. So, there is often that kind of, I see it when I work with young people and it's exam season and they go, I don't know, I can't work. My mum's always on my case. I don't know, I don't know why. And often it comes down to, well, I wonder whether if you work really hard and then you take the exams and then the grades are poor, you don't have the excuse of, well, I didn't revise, so, what could I expect? Much easier in many ways to have the excuse of, I didn't try, therefore the results are bad, rather than I put my all into it, the results are bad. What does that say about me? Am I not bright, or am I stupid, or am I a failure? So there is often that component to self-sabotage, but there are other things that can come into it too, but that is not uncommon, that one.
Is self-sabotage at all related to people who retain a victim mindset, even though they're not what you would call a victim in the traditional sense, but they retain that mindset such that it gets them off the hook? It relieves them of the responsibility maybe that they should actually possess at any given moment.
So when you say a victim mindset, so what you mean specifically?
Well, people, I suppose, who are put upon and they wear the mantle of a victim so that they don't have to take on responsibility.
So sometimes people feel a victim, not because they don't have to take on responsibility, but for you never know what's in someone's past necessarily. And sometimes people have really struggled. And actually there has been a lot of adversity. And that mindset comes from, well, bad things do always happen. So I've got to expect bad things to happen. And then if I expect bad things to happen, I can't feel bad. That's sometimes what's going on. Look, victim mindset, not taking responsibility, permissive thinking, there is always a possibility to relate them, right? But I slightly rebel on the victim mindset point because I think most people do not enjoy feeling bad. So so if you're in that, oh, woe is me, everything always happens to me, what, there's a reason. And when we understand the reason, we can help someone move out of it. So it's probably why I'm not giving you the answer maybe you were hoping for, because I slightly think, well, it's like when people talk about, attention-seeking kids. And I think, well, if they're seeking attention, it's whether or not we would say they need the attention, they're somewhere feeling a lack of it. So they're seeking it because it's what they might need in that moment. And I feel slightly the same when it comes to victim mindsets. Although that said, it's not necessarily a position I find myself terribly comfortable with. I need to be able to help someone shift it, to be able to work with it. If someone is very wedded to it, then I struggle personally. But if someone is very wedded to it, there is always a reason, right? There is a reason why that is the best position for that person to have in that moment.
Yeah, the reason why I brought up the term victim mindset was because I was chatting with a friend of mine yesterday who, when I told him that I was going to be speaking with you today, said, look, ask her about the victim mindset, because he works with somebody who always portrays or characterizes themselves as a victim, and to the annoyance of their work colleagues. So I was interested. I was interested to hear your thoughts about what the origin of that status is, because they seem to cling to that particular identity, as I said, to the annoyance of the people who works with
But
them.
it is profoundly irritating, right? It is. It can be. I am actually with your friend there. I find it very irritating. That's why I say I need to be able to help someone shift it, to be able to continue working with it, because it does wind me up. But I would say, with my compassionate hat on, there is usually a reason and a purpose and a function to holding on to that victim mindset. So the key would be, what is the function of maintaining that state? What does it do for you that you feel you can't get without it? Why is it the best state when it winds everyone up and irritates them? Why is it still functional?
Yeah.
And I think when you approach it maybe with that bit of curiosity, it doesn't become less frustrating, but it becomes slightly easier to think. Because actually, when you're frustrated, you can't think, can you? So, if you're driven mad by something or somebody, it's very hard to think your way through it. Whereas if you can be curious about why is this successful for you? Why is this effective for you? Everybody is irritated. Why is it a good place for you to be? What's it doing for you? It's slightly easier.
I'll pass on that message then to my friend. Be more empathetic and be more
No,
curious.
I didn't say empathetic. I just said curious about why it works.
If I can ask you, in your experience, how often is it the case that anxiety stems from a lack of purpose, a lack of meaning, and uncertainty in general?
Uncertainty for sure. Really, really frequently. People really like certainty. It makes them feel safe, right? And a lack of certainty can make people feel destabilized. Only the thing is that there's nothing that's certain in life, because you never know what's around the corner. So the only thing that is certain is uncertainty. At least that's my belief. So I think we really have to get comfortable with uncertainty, because however certain you think your arrangement is, or however certain you think your plan is, you can go down with COVID later tonight, or something else can happen, or something else can happen. So even when you think everything is certain and beautifully planned and beautifully scripted and laid out and organized, you have no idea, really. So for me, I think uncertainty is really common and deeply and very closely related to anxiety. Lack of purpose, I think, is something quite different. to uncertainty. They can, of course, be interlinked, but a lack of purpose and a lack of focus can lead to anxiety. I think it more often will lead to low mood. And again, with low mood, anxiety can creep in. But I would say that the uncertainty is the biggest link there.
And what advice would you have then to help people deal with that uncertainty? It's, I suppose, an awareness of it. And would it be advisable then to be constantly reminding yourself that nothing is concrete, nothing is for sure, and living, I suppose, in the moment rather than living in a what if kind of scenario?
So anxiety lives predominantly in the future. You can't be anxious about what's happening right in this moment, because this moment is happening, then it's past. So even if the future is 2 or 3 minutes down the line, anxiety can only survive in the future. That's why all of the kind of practices like meditation and mindfulness really focus on the present for anxiety. If that's a practice you resonate with, you enjoy, one of the benefits is it keeps you, or tries to get you, grounded in the present rather than focusing on the future. The other, of course, disadvantage of focusing on the future is you miss all the good stuff that happens in your present. Depression is more linked to the past, not entirely, but the easiest way to think about them is anxiety is future focused, depression is more past focused. Being in the present is wherever possible the best place to be.
I'm glad you mentioned grounding. I know you're a fan of it, physically lying down and taking your shoes off and actually touching the floor or the ground. And I suppose meditation, which you also mentioned, meditation is the mental version of grounding too.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to know that the reason so many professionals and non-professionals and yoga teachers and everybody who works in the anxiety space or in the mental health space talks about meditation and mindfulness is because there's an awful lot of scientific evidence to show that it actually changes our physiological state. It's not just some kind of, oh yeah, well, take 10 minutes and kind of go, it changes the physiological state. So those people who meditate regularly have a slightly slower heartbeat. They're able to bring their heart rate down. And of course, when your heart rate drops, you become less anxious because it's communication to the brain that you're safe, because when you're anxious, your heart rate rises. So there's lots of physiology in meditation in particular that is extremely effective for dealing with anxiety in particular. But yes, it also grounds you. It brings you into the present moment. It makes you feel connected with your body. One of the things, again, when we get very anxious, we can dissociate. We kind of feel out of body. So connecting back in with our body and into our body is a really important process and something that makes us feel grounded. It's why I quite like all, as you mentioned, the quite concrete strategies of sitting on the floor. Actually connect with the ground. You don't have to do everything mentally. Connect, feel it, touch it, engage your senses, really feel yourself rooted. Use a bit of compression to go, I'm actually, yep, no, I can't push through this floor. I am properly touching the floor, touching the wall, touching the desk, whatever it may be. I am grounded in myself, in this space, with this floor, this wall, or this chair, or whatever it is, rather than that kind of frightening feeling of being out of body and in the future and in your head and not quite connected.
A few minutes ago, you briefly alluded to media and social media. I just wanted to ask you, what contributory factor does social media play in the context of people who are already experiencing a great degree of anxiety? If I can just say about myself, I have actually logged off Twitter in recent weeks simply because it's such a negative and toxic stream, and it was, I think, affecting my own mood. So could you just give me your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I think I should say, before I launch into all the negatives of social media, that there are some really, if you curate your accounts and
Sure.
you are careful with who you follow, you can get some really, really great stuff. For example, there are some excellent psychologists putting out excellent, robust information that can be super helpful, particularly in the climate when it's hard to access help. So I want to be a little bit balanced and say that you can find really good stuff out there. But of course, one of the issues is that we'll find something, and often it's the negative stuff that engages us, because the reason we become hooked on a thought, or the reason we become hooked watching something, is often because it activates us emotionally. There's lots of emotional content, and often it's negative emotional content. So we end up watching stuff that makes us worried or makes us low. And then we kind of scroll, and then we seek to validate. And then the algorithm chucks out more of the same at us. And suddenly we are down the black hole of content that is really detrimental to our mental health. I think, like you say, on Twitter or on any of these accounts, it's unbelievably easy to become polarized. It's really easy to read comments and feel very distressed about the state of the world, or to feel very distressed about something you feel passionate about that other people are denigrating. It is really easy. For as much as it's wonderful to be able to say you can always find your people nowadays, because there's always someone who is your person somewhere in the world on social media, you have to be so careful and really so savvy and protective of yourself, and only really follow and interact with people you feel are helpful, interesting, whatever you need to get and give. So I think it can be really difficult. Also, there's of course the stuff where much of the it used to be Instagram that was the main culprit for this, but things are changing. But it is so easy to forget that people curate their content, and so you are getting best versions of everything, or potentially worse depending on what the content is, but you're getting best versions. And so if you're into social comparisons, of course everybody else's life looks amazing and sunny and joyful, and they look their very best. That is not what they look like when they roll out of bed at 4:30 in the morning feeling terrible, or when they've had a row, or when they're low. So content is so I think people are more aware of this, and certainly as kids are growing up with more and more social media, I think that is being taught more. But it is still hard when you get sucked into it, isn't it, to remember that what you're watching is somebody's 500th take with filters.
No, exactly. I completely agree. And I also agree that there are some terrific social media accounts out there, and there is an awful lot of wisdom, but you have to, as you say, curate your feed. That's an external dialogue. If we can talk about an internal dialogue, how do we go about curating that internal chatter, which can at times be quite catastrophic and catastrophize things and really lower our mood? How do we deal with negative self-talk?
It's a really good question. Actually, it reminds me of something you asked earlier, which just left my brain again, which was around exactly this. What is the worst thing you can do? You asked me something like, what helps, what doesn't. And one of the worst things we can do is try and get rid of it without being thoughtful. So when we try and get rid of self-talk and just go, I've got to get rid of that, it's really uncomfortable, I hate it, or I feel stupid, then we're just pushing it down. We're not actually acknowledging it. We're trying to kind of shut the box. And we have to work really hard to get rid of feelings. We can't really get rid of feelings. What we have to learn to do instead is surf them, a bit like going surfing in the sea, urge surfing or thought surfing, or whatever you want to call it. And so you can notice it and you can go, oh, yep, that's me speaking very negatively about myself. You have to catch it first. You have to, step one is noticing you're doing it, right? So if you don't notice you're doing it, there's not much you can do about it. You'll get sucked in and you'll keep doing it. But once you notice, then every time you do it, hopefully you will catch yourself. The more you catch yourself, the more you'll notice. The more you notice, the more you catch yourself. So it becomes a virtuous spiral in terms of that. And then you can say, hang on a minute, let me pause. Let me just pause. And if you want, you can go down there. Lots of different ways to do it, and what works for people is different, right? But one of the ways is you can challenge it. You can say, is this thought actually right? Is it? Let me just go through the factors. Am I a complete waste of space? Well, let me see. Actually, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. I've gone to work, or I met this deadline, or I had a great time at a party, or no, not a waste of space. So you can become, you can challenge it that way. You can go with the kind of number one rule in psychology: a thought is just a thought. Just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. And that sounds so straightforward, and it is the reality. It's hard to hold on to, but it is true. Just because you think something doesn't mean it's true. We have thousands and thousands of thoughts every day. We only hold on to the ones or notice the ones that are loaded with negative emotional content usually. And so they're the ones that suck us in and we pay more attention to. Whereas actually they're just a thought like anything else. While we've been talking, you'll have had lots of thoughts that you haven't articulated that have come into your head and gone out of your head about all sorts of things probably. That's normal, but we don't notice and we don't get hooked. So the good old, it's just a thought, it's not a fact. That's really useful. And then learning, okay, look, there's that thought again. Okay, do I want to engage, or shall I just surf until, do something else, notice it's there, sit with it, and just like a wave, the peak of it will rise and then it'll fall, because you can't stay at that heightened, even though people might feel anxious or distressed all the time. Actually, even if it's a minimal change, it peaks and it swells and it falls and it swells and it falls. And the analogy is one of waves in the sea. You can't stop the waves in the sea. If you stand at the front of the sea and you go, right, I'm not going to allow any of these waves to break onto the shore, you're not going to be very successful. And indeed, the more you stand there trying to stop the waves, the more likely you are to be taken out by the waves. If you imagine that you're a surfer, you wait for the wave. When it comes, you jump on it, you surf it. And as it comes down, you surf down. You're much less likely to be knocked over by the wave. And that is the same with emotions and thoughts, but the thoughts tend to lead to emotions. It's why we don't like them. That when we talk about negative thoughts, it's because it makes us feel bad. A negative thought that comes in and goes out, we don't mind. It just kind of passes through. So if you can think of that surfing analogy and go, I'm just going to ride it. I'm going to read my book or call a friend or distract myself, or just notice it's there, but not necessarily engage with it and know that the way I feel about myself will change. That's a really great way to do it as well.
And I know you're a fan of not just sitting with your emotion, but actually feeling how it's expressed in the body. Can you talk to me about this?
Yeah, I am a fan. I am a fan of that. I think that our body and our mind, of course, I differentiate, but I don't think there's a mind and there's a body and they're two separate entities. I think that school of thinking, thankfully, is waning. But we feel anxiety is a really good demonstration of this. When we feel anxious, we have loads of physical symptoms, right? Heart rate, we get palpitations, we get hot, we get sweaty, some people get cold, you feel a bit sick, you might get an upset stomach, lump in your throat, you might cry, you might hyperventilate, loads of physical symptoms. Understanding that they are caused by the adrenaline that's running around our system is really helpful, right? Because you can go, okay, obviously my brain is sending out adrenaline, I'm not dying, or this is a normal response, this is an anxiety response, and you can learn to understand it, and you can learn to recognize it, and you can learn to be curious about it rather than panic or feel distressed about it. Similarly, if you feel very angry, understanding what it does in your body, we have a lot of physiology when we're angry, and also when we're joyful, we have quite a lot of physiology. So to pretend that these are just emotional states with no bodily component means that we're trying to kind of disconnect mind and body. And we're missing out on a huge amount of information. Whatever you do with that information is a whole different conversation. But when you can tune into what you're feeling physically, at the same time, you've got lots of information about how you are and where you are and whether you're grounded and whether, I wasn't thinking I was anxious, but actually I've suddenly got all of these symptoms. Let me be curious. Let me notice that. There's some information there that could be useful to me. What's happening?
At what point in the anxiety cycle do you advise deploying a technique which I know you're very much a proponent of, and that is the stop technique? Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah. It's as early as possible is the answer, because stop technique is really quick and simple. Now, you need to get it to use it effectively. I would say you need to get it you need to be quite early in that anxiety cycle. But what it is, and you can use it with thoughts, is when you notice that thought coming in that's going to pull you down the spiral, you just go, stop, not interested. Stop, no, stop, not interested. Literally, that's what it is. You can visualize a kind of a red stop sign at the traffic lights or whatever it might be. And you just say, no, I'm not going down that path. And what that does, it won't stop the thought coming in, right? The thought might come in again, but it'll stop you spiraling down the whole cycle to the catastrophe at the end of it. You just go, actually, no, not engaging, stop. And the thought will come again, stop. And if you practice it, excuse me, if you practice it, you'll notice that the gaps in between or the gaps between when you have to say stop, how many times you say stop get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you might have to say stop 60 times in your first hour, but if you keep practicing it over time, you'll just be using it less. You go, oh, there it is again, stop. Yeah. And then it'll go for much longer. It's about intervening rather than getting hooked. If you imagine you go fishing, when you put the bait in on the end of the fishing line. I'm not a fisher, by the way, so if I get this analogy wrong, you can pull me up on it. But you put bait on the end of your hook, you cast your line, the hook goes in the water, and you hope that the fish takes the bait, because when they take the bait, the hook will go and catch them, and they will be caught, and you can then catch a fish. And it's exactly the same. The bait is kind of the negative thought. Our mind throws out the bait. It's the negative thought. And then it goes fishing and we go, there's that negative thought, and we catch it and we become hooked. And a bit like the fish on the end of the fish hook, we're suddenly totally engaged and caught with that thought. And the key is to kind of unhook and go, hang on a minute, how do I unhook from this? One, I can just say stop, which is stop technique. Stop, no, stop, no, I'm not engaging. I'm not going to go down that path now. But there are other ways to do it as well, and say, oh, okay, well, I'm going to distance myself. I'm going to kind of become less fused. I'm going to become more of an observer rather than in it. I'm going to observe it. I'm going to take a step back. There are loads. I mean, it is difficult. There are so many techniques I could kind of throw out at this moment, but the key is not to deny the thought or the feeling, because then you spend your time having to push it away. And it's a bit like when a child knocks at the door. If you open the door first time and say, what do you need, and they tell you can attend or you cannot attend, but if you don't open the door, they'll keep knocking and keep knocking and keep knocking louder and louder and more insistently until they just come in. And that's exactly the same, and that's understandable. There's nothing wrong with that. That's normal. And that's exactly the same if you try and suppress and just get rid of your thoughts and feelings. It's a bit like that. They'll knock again. Come on, pay attention to me. Knock louder and louder and louder until actually you're at the one point or place, you're in a meeting or you're at a party and you find yourself overwhelmed. And that is the last place you want to be thinking or feeling whatever it is. And it's because you spent your time trying to get rid of it. So the key is not to ignore it, but the key is to notice it and try and become less hooked by it.
Fabulous. So much great advice. Dr. Anna Colton, if people want to find out more about you and reach out to you, where can they go?
So I'm at Dr. Anna Colton on Instagram and TikTok and LinkedIn. And if you put me into Google, you'll find me there too.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. It's such an early hour this morning. Really enjoyed our conversation. Dr. Anna Colton, thank you.
Thank you for having me.